My name is Julie Thatcher. Today I will be teaching you how to undo your mistakes while knitting. Normally I would be teaching this workshop in person, but because we live in strange times, I am doing this from my home studio. Please bear with me for any technical difficulties or awkwardness because this is my first time teaching a class this way. I'm sure I'll get better as I go on, but for now let's just go with it. I'll be walking you through the PowerPoint I normally use when I teach this class, and I will also be working alongside you and showing you exactly what we're doing using this setup, which I am very excited about. I will show you 3 major techniques. I will teach you when to use them and when not to use them. I do expect you to follow along with this class, but I will go over how to do that in just a moment. And I will also let you know when to pause during practical sections so that you get enough time to finish them before we move on to the next topic. So with all that said, let's move right along. So what you'll need to do this workshop is some knitting you don't mind tearing up, preferably stockinette stitch, because that's what I'll be using, which is just purl 1 row, knit 1 row, purl 1 row, etc., etc. So I have this square I knit before class. It's got a couple of mistakes I deliberately put in there. Maybe you'll have deliberate mistakes, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll have accidental ones. Either way, we'll be making and fixing mistakes all day today, so don't worry about it. You should also have a yarn needle, which is just this big blunt needle with a big eye that you can thread yarn through. A crochet hook in roughly the same size as your knitting needles, honestly you could just eyeball it, I did, is very helpful. You can do most of these techniques with knitting needles, but a crochet hook is just so much easier. And then a safety pin or a removable stitch marker, that's this little blue fella here, and I'll show you what we're doing with those in just a little bit. So let's see, next we will be doing alright, the 3 different methods and when to use them. So first method is called frogging, which is just tearing out several rows of knitting. It is good for when you're doing an especially complicated pattern such as lace or cables and you mess something up, in which case you'll need to rewind down to your previous kind of lifeline or line break, or you spot a big mistake many rows down that's really going to mess you up later. I'll explain what a lifeline is and how to use it when we go through this. The next thing is going to be dropping stitches, which is, and I'll just show you frogging now just so you see what I'm talking about when we get there. It's called frogging because you just rip out your knitting like so. And the name's a joke. It comes from rip it, rip it, rip it, like frog. And then dropping a stitch is when you have stitches on the needle and one of them accidentally comes off and either stays off the needle or starts to unravel, and I'll show you what a drop stitch looks like. So right now we have all stitches on the needle. I'm going to drop this one on purpose, and you'll see it starts to unravel down the rows, and it gets caught by this lifeline, and I'll explain exactly how that works and how to do one once we get to that section. But you can see the laddering here where the yarn that used to be part of this stitch is now just loose. It's exactly like when you get a run in your stockings. We call that laddering or a run. And then our final technique will be tinking, which is just knitting backwards, and that's literally where the name comes from, T-I-N-K-K-N-I-T. And that is good for when you spotted a mistake earlier in the same row or the row below and you want to very carefully unwind. I'll explain exactly how that works later. Some of which technique you decide to use is just based on which technique you're best at. There are of course situations where one is ideal and one is not ideal, but you know, my mom always said the quickest road between 2 destinations is the one you know. The quickest method to fix a mistake is the one you are the best at. But do be sure to practice all of them because there are going to be situations where one is better than the others. Let's see, what else? Alright, key concept and the biggest takeaway you could get from this class right now is visualizing how a knit stitch works. So over on the left here, I have a large drawing of a single knit stitch, and you can see that is the stitch from the row below. This is the stitch that is live that you're working on. You can see how it's looped through in kind of a horseshoe shape. That's what it looks like without a knitting needle through it. This is what it looks like with a knitting needle through it. The golden rule and the visual that you should have in your head is that this leg on your right goes over the needle, and this leg on your left goes behind the needle. This is going to be true for knit or purl. Why is this the golden rule? Because this is the end goal of all of these methods, is to restore stitches to this configuration. You're going to find as you're frogging or unknitting that you're going to be unsure how to do that. And as long as you end up with all of your stitches in the correct order looking like this, you're all set. And I'll show you over on the big display with a bigger piece of knitting exactly what I'm talking about. Give me just a second. So I have this much larger piece of knitting, and you can see that same visual I was showing you that I had drawn. This is the stitch below the one on the needle, so like that, and you can see it goes behind like that, and then the live stitch on the needle comes in from this side, goes up and over, and then comes out that side. And as you can see, it's got that right leg in front and that left leg in the back. And you can see all of them are like that, and I'll show you what it looks like when one of them is flipped. So I'm going to flip this one right here. And you see when they're sitting kind of neutral on the needles, they all sort of slant ever so slightly to the right, except for this guy, slants to the left because the wrong leg is in front. So if you find yourself knitting or frogging or putting stitches back on the needle and one of them is flipped, the way you fix it is to just take it off the needle, turn it around, put it back on correctly. Very simple, hopefully painless, we'll see. Alright, that's that. So the first technique we'll be covering is frogging and lifelines. Frogging again is called that because you rip it, rip it, rip it. My best advice for frogging is do not be aggressive even if you are frustrated, because a lot of yarn is going to like to get tangled up in knots or caught on itself, and it'll just trip you up and make you feel even more frustrated. So the best way to frog is gently and calmly and slowly. And also, if you can manage it, the best way to frog is to lay your knitting on a flat surface. And when you frog, you take it off the needles, so don't panic just yet. Is to lay it on a flat surface and then put some weight on it. So you can use like a book. I just happen to have a random bit of wood because I'm in my workshop right now. I'll use that, but you can also just use your hand if you're really stuck. You just lay it down, put some weight on it, and then when you frog, when you start unraveling, you'll find you can't really unravel past this row right here because you've got weight on it. Obviously I can't, well not obviously, can't unravel past this lifeline right here, and that is exactly what a lifeline is for. It prevents you from unraveling further and ensures that when you are done frogging, you are on the same row, totally reset down to that row, and that you are able to put the stitches easily back on the needles. And I'm going to do that now just to show you what that looks like. So when you're running a lifeline, you're going to want to run it the same way you would the needle. So it'll go through each stitch with the right leg in front of the lifeline, left leg behind. And I'll go over that in a little bit more detail in just a moment, but just so you see what we're talking about and you have this in your head. Alright, I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint while I finish that up. All right. So, my best advice for running a lifeline is to use a slightly thinner yarn or thread in a contrasting color. If all you have available is yarn, in a similar color, that's fine too, as long as you can tell the difference. And I know it says strong, but what I really mean by that is just something that if you pull on it isn't going to come apart. So almost any yarn in your collection will do, I'm sure. Things I wouldn't recommend using are like sewing thread or embroidery thread, just because those are so thin that they may not actually work to keep your yarn from unraveling. They may just decide to go with it. It is easiest to run a lifeline row while the yarn is still on the needles, but it is doable after the fact. I'll show you how to do that. And again, lifeline should always follow the rule of right leg in front, left leg in back. Alright, so where do you put a lifeline? That's a relevant question here, and the answer is wherever it makes sense to you. If you're doing a pattern that repeats every row forever, like this knit 2 purl 2 rib on the screen, then put it every 10 rows or every 20 or whatever makes sense to you, whatever wouldn't make you cry if you had to unravel down to that. A lot of complex patterns, especially yarns and laces and cables, will have repeats, so every 4 lines or so will be the same. So it would be best to put the lifeline at the beginning or the end of each repeat, so that way if you have to unravel, you know exactly where you are. Some patterns have kind of a relief row, where you do your complex lace work or your complex cables on one row, and the next row will be like all pearls or all knits. That's a really good row to put it on. You should mark on your pattern where you're intending to put the lifeline. So if you intend to put it on, row 1 of a 4-row repeat, just write that, like put LL next to it or something like that. You should avoid putting lifelines on rows with a lot of increases or decreases or complex lace work, because it can get very messy to unravel too, and sometimes it doesn't quite work. Do leave your lifelines in. This is why I always recommend using a yarn you don't care much about or you have a lot of extra of. Because you may end up frogging a lot, depending on how complicated your pattern is. You may need to frog all the way down to like the 2nd or 3rd lifeline down. You may need to frog all the way back to the 1st one. Just leave them in. It won't hurt your knitting to do that. Alright. So I'm going to practice putting in a lifeline. I'm going to practice frogging. I will show you how to do both of those. So to put in a lifeline while your stitches are still on the needle, you'll want to have finished a row so they're all in the same needle. You'll want your needle threaded with your lifeline yarn, and then you're just going to run this needle right alongside your knitting needle so that every stitch is following the golden rule, and you're just going to run it right alongside, just like that. And you'll want to do this all the way across the row. So I'm going to have you practice doing this while I'm doing it, and then I'll show you how to put in a lifeline 4 rows down, and then we'll practice unraveling to that. But I gotta finish this first, so let's just do that. And you can, as you're seeing me do this, you can run it through several stitches at once. It just kind of depends on what's easiest. Just kind of got to go with the flow. Alright. So now we have our lifeline. If we continue knitting, what you'll want to do is keep that lifeline down at the bottom of the stitches where it currently is, and I'll show you just a couple of stitches of purl just so you see what's going on there. And you see the lifeline is basically invisible. You can't even really tell it's there. It doesn't interfere with your knitting. Do try not to knit it into the next row. That does happen. Not a big deal. You can always just pull it back out, but just, keep things as neat as you can. So yeah, that's what that looks like once you've knit the next row, and there you go, you've made a lifeline. And now I can unravel these safely. And put them back on the needle. Alright, so now what I want you to do is pull that lifeline out, and we're going to put a lifeline in a few rows down. It doesn't need to be 4, that's just a good starting point. And I'm going to switch to the big yarn and the big needle just so that you can see exactly what's going on here. Alright. So, I have got a really big needle with some really big yarn, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a row, and again, this helps if you can lay this out on a flat surface and just sort of, smooth it into place, and then your rows will line up nicely. I am going to pick this row, a few down. You can see here I messed up this stitch on purpose just so that I could show you that frogging gets rid of it. So I'm going to pick this row right here, and I'm going to start right at this stitch, right on the edge, and you can see it's got that kind of chain structure. I'm going to go under the right leg, and then I'm going to find the next stitch, go under the right leg, over the left leg, under the right, over the left, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, and so on, across the whole row. I'm going to pull some of this yarn through. Go under, over, under, over, and then under. And your edge stitches are always going to be a little bit messy. It's okay if you just guess which row you're looking at. Not that big a deal. It's only one stitch out of your whole row. Alright, so now that I have placed the lifeline, I am going to pull the needle out, and I am going to find the end, which is somewhere, there it is, and just pull. And again, be gentle, don't go too hard on it or you will get tangles. And there we go. Alright, so now we're on our lifeline row, and you could tell because if I try to unravel this anymore, it starts to pull the lifeline through. So now you'll want to thread this back onto your needle. Like so, and again, right leg in front, left leg behind. Alright, now if I want to, I can pull out the lifeline and we are reset as if nothing happened. And I will show you real quick, just using my block of wood here, how to unravel using that, in case you were wondering. It's best if it completely covers the row, but if not, that's okay too. And we just slowly and gently pull, and you can see that because everything is pinned down and not moving, we're able to be a lot more gentle and we're able to unravel a lot more carefully. Alright, so if you've done all that, you have now frogged and you are a proper amphibian. And if you need more time to finish this practice, now is the time to pause because we're moving on to the next section. And I'm going to pause here for a moment and get some water. Alright, we are now on to the next section, which is dropping a stitch. Sometimes this happens by accident, sometimes you want to do it on purpose because you've seen a mistake you made. I am going to show you two common mistakes for which you might want to drop a stitch. Give me just a second. Alright, so let's say you are knitting along happily, you pause to count your stitches and you realize you are missing one. You look at your knitting and you see a drop stitch way down there. And you think, oh no, I have to unravel all the way down there to fix that. The answer is no, you don't. What you should do instead is grab something and stick it through that stitch so that it does not unravel more. And I'm actually going to get the bigger yarn to show you with this, so that is hard to see. Just give me just a second. Gotta put this back on the needle, because it would be quite shameful if this just unraveled in the middle of this demonstration. Alright. Okay, there we go. Alright. So, you see here this stitch right here has fallen off the needle and unraveled a couple of rows, and then we just kept knitting. So what we're going to do to fix this is first we are going to save the stitch by just sticking something through it. Could be, you know, a pencil, it could be a safety pin, it could be a removable stitch marker, whatever works. But don't panic, don't try to unravel just yet. Then we're going to isolate the stitch. So we can see, based on the laddering, that this is between these two stitches. So we're going to slip the stitches on either side to a needle. And that way we can isolate this stitch and fix it. And there we go. Alright, then we're going to grab that crochet hook from earlier, and we are going to pull the stitch up so that you can see very clearly the loop right there, and then we're going to insert the crochet hook into the loop, and now we're going to knit it back up the ladder. And this works even if you dropped the stitch many rows ago and you can't see the ladder anymore. As long as you isolate it, you should be able to see the line between the two stitches. If you fix, I'll show you on the smaller piece, but if you fix a drop stitch on smaller yarn, it may get tense. That's okay, it will work itself out during the blocking after you finish knitting. Anyways, I'll get there when I get there. Alright, so we're gonna go back up the ladder. What we're gonna do is we're gonna use our crochet hook to grab the next row up, and we're gonna pull it through the stitch on the crochet hook. And I'll show you that again. We're going to grab the next row up and we're going to pull it through the crochet hook. Again, this may get tense depending on when and where you drop the stitch. It's okay. We are now back up to the same level as our other stitches. So what we're going to do is we're going to slide this onto one of the knitting needles following the golden rule. So you can see right now I've got it so that the right leg is over this crochet hook, and I'm just going to slide the crochet hook out and replace it with a knitting needle. There you go. Again, a little tense, but that will work itself out. And we are almost back to normal. All we have to do is slip all of those stitches back over so that our working yarn is at the last stitch on the right needle. That is going to be this one right here. Alright, so that's how that works. And I'm going to pause really quick and fix the drop stitch on the smaller one so I can show you what I mean about the laddering getting tense on smaller yarn. Give me just a moment. So I am in the middle of fixing this stitch and I am moving up the ladder, but as you can see I knit quite a few rows above it. So the ladder is kind of invisible at first glance, but if you pull these stitches really hard apart, you can see that ladder right down the middle, and that's how you're going to fix that. But you can also see as I'm going up, this is getting very tense down here. Stitches are kind of crowding each other almost, and that is just because you're using the same amount of yarn you would for 2 stitches to make 3 essentially. But when you do blocking, which is the first wash after you're done knitting, what that causes everything to do is tense up and then relax all at once. And when it does that, it will even the tension out across the row. So it should be fine. Don't worry if it looks a little funny while you're still in the process of knitting. And now we are going to slip that back onto the needle and we are reset to where we are supposed to be. Now the other situation where you might want to drop a stitch is the opposite situation where you've created more stitches than you need to. You can see right here I've done an accidental yarn over and then I've kept knitting and now I have an extra stitch right there. And you'll see these sometimes in your own knitting. Sometimes they're just a result of uneven tension, odd yarn, strange needles. Sometimes those holes are supposed to be there, sometimes they aren't. The way you can tell is to look above the hole and below the hole. If above the hole you have a line of stitches going up, and then below the hole you've got a line of laddering going down, that means you've created a new stitch and you need to get rid of it. So the way we're going to get rid of that is to scooch our stitches over until we've isolated the wrong stitch, the new stitch. And that is this stitch right here. And we are going to drop it off and deliberately let it go. And again, this is going to create a tension problem where you now have an enormous ladder where you just had a neat row of stitches before. So one of my pieces of advice is if you are knitting something where one extra stitch doesn't really matter, maybe don't fix it. But this particular issue, this laddering, will be worked out during blocking. And I'm going to block this piece and show it to you after I have finished the class, just so you can see I'm not lying about that. Alright, I'm going to put those all on one needle. Leave that there for now. And go back to the PowerPoint. So, right, this is just the walkthrough of how to fix a drop stitch. We just went over that in person. Same idea for dropping a stitch on purpose. If you are not 100% sure whether you're dealing with a genuine yarn over or whether you're just dealing with a freckle, you know, an accidental little hole, put a stitch marker below your problem stitch before you unravel, and that way if you accidentally drop it too low, you can ladder your way back up and fix your fixing. So in this case, that's what you would do. You would put a stitch marker just in the row below and essentially use that as like a tiny extra lifeline. Alright, so let's see what's next. So what's next is that we are going to practice dropping a stitch and then knitting it back. And I am going to pick a stitch in the middle of this one. And it's going to be this stitch because it is, let me switch. It's going to be this stitch right here because I've accidentally knit where I meant to purl. And it's kind of hard to see. You can kind of see there's just an irregularity there. And if I drop that stitch and then knit it back, that will fix that irregularity. So first we gotta isolate, and you can just pick any stitch on any column to practice this on. Just gonna isolate, 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 see, almost there. Alright, I have now isolated the stitch. It is off the needles. And I am going to put a stitch marker in the row, a couple of rows below. And I'm going to just hook that through there. Alright, now we're going to let it ladder down. Let it unravel. And you can see the stitch marker has saved the day here. Kept us from unraveling this all the way to the bottom. If you do have something that unravels all the way to the bottom and your cast on row is now missing a stitch, you will unfortunately need to restart, because fixing that is going to end up with some kind of ugliness down in your cast on row, unless you don't care about ugliness in your cast on row, in which case feel free, ladder it back up. Most people won't notice this, and most people don't really care, but if you do care, you may want to restart. Alright, so now I'm going to take that stitch marker out so that I can put my crochet hook in its place. I'm going to spread these a little so that it's easier to see the ladder rungs. And I am going to go up the ladder. So something to note here, this works on stockinette stitch. If you are just doing garter stitch where it's knit on one side, purl on the other, what you're going to want to do is on the knit side, on the row with the nice V's where your knit stitches are, you're going to want to do this. But when you get to the purl side, you're actually going to want to reverse everything, which makes this technique kind of annoying, but still workable. You're going to reverse everything. Get your drop stitch behind your work. You're going to grab that, pull it through, and then you're going to reverse everything again. Get your drop stitch in front and do the same thing. Alright, you're going to hold on to that. But since we are just doing stockinette stitch today, we are just going to ladder up and slide that back onto our needle. Make sure we aren't accidentally grabbing the stitch below as well. And there we are, we're all set. And I'm just going to push all of these stitches over to the right hand needle to just get us totally reset back to normal. Alright. So now you'll want to pause if you need more time to practice this, or if you want to go back, because we are moving on to tinking. And I'm going to pause here and take a quick break. Alright, we are now on to our third and final technique, which is tinking. The word tinking literally comes from the word knit backwards, K-N-I-T, T-N-I-K. Literally, that is how the technique works. So what you want to do is make sure that your working yarn is on the correct side of your knitting, which if you are on a knit row is going to be behind your yarn if it is behind your work. If you're on a purl row, it's going to be on the front. Then what you're going to do is essentially do the reverse of all the steps you would do to knit. And I'm going to show you exactly how that works using my big demo yarn and big demo needle. Give me just a second. Alright, so right now we are on a purl row. We want to back up a few stitches. So what I'm going to do, and you see this is my working yarn, it's in front because we're on a purl row. I am going to take my right hand needle and insert it into the stitch below the working stitch on the left hand needle, so below the one we just knit. And then I am going to slide the new stitch off and unravel it. And we're just going to do that one by one. So I'm going to insert it into the one below, I'm going to slide the old stitch off and then unravel. And the reason why you want your yarn to be in the correct position beforehand is that if your yarn is behind, for example, while you're undoing a purl stitch, you're going to end up with your yarn tangled up in your stitch as you try to unravel it. So by ensuring that it is in the front, we ensure that we can unravel neatly. That's all. And you'll want it to be based on the stitch you are unraveling to as opposed to the one you are unraveling from, if that makes sense. So right now we got it like that, but if I was unraveling to a knit stitch, like right now these are all purl stitches because this is the back of the piece, but if I was unraveling to a knit stitch further down, I'd want to ensure the yarn was in the back for that. It'll make more sense if you do it, and yeah, just try it. It'll make more sense. Okay, so let's see, what else do I need to remind you of? Follow the golden rule. So stitch below, you want to make sure you've got right leg in front, left leg in back. And that's pretty much it. It's fairly easy. It's just that thinking backwards is hard. So this one doesn't come naturally at all. But just think of the 4 steps you take to knit a stitch, where you, let me just show you, where you insert, wrap around, pull through, push the old stitch off. Now to undo, you insert, pull the new stitch off, unwrap around, and reset, and you're there. Now, the more important thing with tinking is making sure that you end up with that neat row of finished stitches with every right leg over the needle, then making it look perfect at first. As long as you end up doing it correctly, it will look good eventually. So let's see, that's just the diagram version of the same. And right now we're going to practice tinking, and I'm going to show you using multiple stitches at once, tinking multiple stitches at once. I'll use the smaller one for that because it'll be easier to do. And I expect you to do at least 4 before we move on to the next. I'm going to end up doing a whole row. Places where you might find this useful is if you realize you've miscounted or you've somehow wound up with the wrong number of stitches partway through a row, and that way you can back up to like your last known good spot. Also good if you've dropped a stitch recently and you still see it, you can just put that, you know, temporary stitch marker in, rewind, grab it, and then keep going. So I'm going to tink a whole row, and I'm going to be very careful. So part of why I am tinking this whole row is because I need to bind this square off so I can block it and show it to you. But I have run out of yarn. I have played yarn chicken and lost. So I'm going to tink a row and then use that extra yarn to do a bind off. And if you do accidentally get your yarn in the wrong spot and get it tangled up, I'll just show you what happens and how to get yourself out of that bind. Alright, so now I'm in a situation where it's not quite working. So just back up, just tink your tink. Put everything back on the left needle where it's supposed to be. Tug on that working yarn, kind of see where you're at. Right now I've got both the stitch below and the working stitch on that left needle, so I'm just going to tease out that working stitch, put that back on by itself, and see we're back where we're supposed to be. Alright, going to insert into the stitch below and unravel, and just do that for the whole row. And I'm going to finish this row off screen. If you need more time to practice tinking, here is where you should pause because I'm going to move on to the next section. Alrighty, so we have finished our 3 techniques. We have finished practicing them. Now we just need to discuss what's the best time to use which one. So, as stated earlier, frogging and lifelines are good for when you're doing a really complex pattern, especially lace and especially cabling. And you need to rewind down to kind of a safety row. Frogging is my main technique, which I am told is terrifying to watch because I will just rip out inches of yarn and not really care, but I have done it for so many years that I know exactly where I'm going with it. I rarely use lifelines, although I really should, and I have occasionally regretted that particular habit. My encouragement is to always have the training wheels on if you think of lifelines as training wheels, because when you do need them, you really need them. Dropping stitches are good for when you've noticed a very small mistake, just 1 or 2 stitches, when you've accidentally dropped a stitch, or you just need to get rid of an extra stitch. Tinking is good when you've spotted a mistake earlier in the row or the row below, or you've just recently dropped a stitch. Again, as I said earlier, the technique you're best at is going to be the one you favor, obviously. Do what makes sense to you in the moment, but do be sure to practice everything, because there's going to be a situation where you think, man, I really wish I knew how to tink because I see a mistake 2 stitches back and I'm not sure how to get there. But as long as you practice, you should be okay for 99% of the mistakes you make. I can honestly not think of a situation where these 3 wouldn't at least help, if not actually fix the mistake. Now, the big exception to the do what feels right thing is lace knitting. Lace knitting uses a lot of different techniques to achieve a very specific texture and pattern. Lace relies on the previous row being a specific way to make the next row work. Tinking or dropping stitches and then trying to rework them through a lace pattern is just not going to work. You may even end up in a situation where some of your stitches are going to be the wrong way around, so even the right leg over rule may not apply. When you are knitting lace, always use a lifeline. Always. Put it on the safety row, put it on the first row of the repeat, whatever you need to do it. And if you find yourself in a situation where you need to unwind some lace and you don't have a lifeline in, you're going to feel really sorry for yourself. So that's your big exception. Thank you very much for watching this workshop. I hope it helped. If you have any questions, I believe my contact information is in the class information. If not, I will edit it into this video after the fact. Thank you very much. Have a good day. So just to do a little extra follow-up, this is the sample square I used for this workshop after blocking it and washing it once. As you can see, the laddering is a little noticeable, but this is after only washing it once and never actually using it. The stuff you knit, as you use it and wash it, those kinds of issues will start to work themselves out. Just wanted to show you that I wasn't kidding about that. That's all. Have a great day.